black. Wind moves through the scrub brush, a whip-poor-will calls somewhere in the dark, and far off, the last rumble of artillery fades into silence. Then, moonlight. A tangle of second-growth oak and pine, so thick you can see maybe 20 feet in any direction. A line of riders moves through the trees, 9 silhouettes, slow, tense, their horses picking through the underbrush. The lead rider sits straight in the saddle, jaw set, eyes scanning the black spaces between the trunks. It is just past 9 at night on May 2nd, 1863. This man has just won the most complete tactical victory of his career, and he is riding back toward his own army, in the dark, surrounded by his own men. A shout tears out of the brush. Cavalry. A single beat of silence. Then the night erupts. Muzzle flashes rip the darkness open. A long, ragged volley of rifle fire. A horse rears in terror. The lead rider is struck 3 times. He begins to fall. The shots that hit him did not come from the Union Army. They came from his own soldiers. This is the story of Thomas Jonathan Jackson, the man they called Stonewall. To understand why this night mattered, you have to understand who he was. By the spring of 1863, Stonewall Jackson was the most feared field commander in the Confederacy. A former professor from the Virginia Military Institute, awkward in conversation, deeply religious, obsessed with speed and secrecy. His men marched so hard and so fast, they earned a nickname of their own. They were called Foot Cavalry. He appeared where the enemy least expected him, and he hit with everything he had. And here, in a patch of Virginia forest called the Wilderness, in Spotsylvania County, he was about to attempt the boldest maneuver of his life. The Union Army of the Potomac was enormous, more than twice the size of Robert E. Lee's force. A cautious general would have retreated. Instead, Lee did something that violated every rule in the book. He split his outnumbered army in 2, and he sent Jackson on a secret march to strike the enemy from behind. What Jackson found waiting on that Union flank would decide the battle, and what happened after would change the war. Early on May 2nd, Jackson's corps of roughly 26,000 men slipped away. They marched about 12 miles through dense forest, guided along back roads and country lanes, screened from Union eyes by the terrain itself. It took most of the day, and at the far end of that march sat the exposed right flank of the Union Army, the 11th Corps under General Oliver Howard. Those soldiers had stacked their rifles. They were cooking supper. Some accounts say the first sign of trouble was deer and rabbits bursting out of the woods, fleeing something behind them. Around 5:15 in the evening, Jackson's men came out of the trees screaming. The attack rolled over Howard's corps and shattered it. Whole units broke and ran. It was, by almost any measure, a masterpiece. The kind of victory that could destroy an entire army. And Jackson wanted more. Darkness was falling, but he did not want to stop. He wanted to press the attack through the night, to cut the Union Army off from the river and finish it. To do that, he needed to see the ground for himself, so he did what he had always done. He rode forward, past his own front lines, into the dark. Here is the detail that decided everything. It was not pitch black that night. There was a full moon, bright enough to throw shapes and silhouettes across the forest floor, but it was not bright enough to tell a gray uniform from a blue one, or a friend from a stranger. Just enough light to create deadly confusion. Jackson and his small staff, perhaps 8 or 9 riders, moved out beyond the picket line to scout the Union positions. The men they had left behind were on edge. Soldiers of the 18th North Carolina Infantry, part of Lane's brigade, had just taken artillery fire. Their nerves were stretched thin. Then they heard horses coming toward them out of the dark from the direction of the enemy. By some accounts, someone shouted a warning of cavalry, and the North Carolinians did what frightened men do. They fired. The volley cut through Jackson's party. His engineer officer, Captain James Keith Boswell, was killed instantly. Others fell. 3 bullets struck Jackson. 1 passed through his left forearm, 1 hit his left wrist, and 1 shattered the bone of his left upper arm, just below the shoulder. He did not die. His horse, Little Sorrel, bolted in panic toward the Union lines, carrying the wounded general straight toward the enemy before his staff could bring the animal under control. A low tree branch nearly swept him from the saddle. Then his own men caught him as he slid down. The most feared commander in the Confederacy had been shot by his own soldiers at the very peak of his triumph. What followed was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Getting Jackson off the field was almost impossible. He had to be carried by litter through the dark under continuing artillery fire. At one point, a litter bearer was hit and dropped his corner, and Jackson fell to the ground, driving fresh trauma into his broken body. Many historians believe that fall mattered more than the bullets. He was taken to a field hospital near the Wilderness Tavern, where his medical director, Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire, examined him. The upper arm was beyond saving. In the early hours of May 3rd, Jackson was given chloroform, and his left arm was amputated about 2 inches below the shoulder. That detail is worth pausing on, because it corrects a myth. There was no biting a bullet. Anesthesia existed, and it was used. Jackson took the news of his lost arm with the same calm faith he brought to everything. By some accounts, he said it was the best that could be done, and thanked God. But out on the field, the battle had not stopped. Command of Jackson's corps had to pass to the cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, who had never before led infantry in a fight of this scale. At the height of the greatest Confederate victory of the war, the man who made it possible was gone. When the news reached Robert E. Lee, his reaction became one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. Told that Jackson had lost his left arm, Lee is said to have replied that Jackson had lost his left arm, but that he, Lee, had lost his right arm. The exact wording varies from account to account, and its authenticity cannot be fully confirmed, but the meaning is solid, and if he said it, it was more than sentiment. It was a strategic verdict. Lee had no other commander he trusted to move fast and strike hard on his own judgment. Jackson was carried by ambulance about 27 miles to the rear, to a quiet plantation office building at Guinea Station, to recover away from the front. His wife, Mary Anna, came to his bedside, and she brought their infant daughter, Julia. By some accounts, Jackson may have first held his newborn child only in these final days, having been away at war since her birth. Now, in what would be his last days, he held her. For a man consumed by war, it was a rare, tender image. But he was not recovering. Pneumonia had set in, most likely a complication of his injuries and the fall from the litter. His strength drained away. On Sunday, May 10th, 1863, drifting in and out of delirium, Jackson spoke his last words. "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." At 3:15 that afternoon, he died. There are pieces of this story that outlived him in strange ways. His amputated arm was buried separately by his chaplain in a family cemetery at a plantation called Elwood, miles from where his body rests in Lexington, Virginia. It has its own grave marker. You can visit it today. The soldiers who fired the volley were never punished. There was no single trigger, no one man to blame. Multiple companies fired at once in the dark. And while the 18th North Carolina is most often named, other units were firing too. No one could ever say for certain whose bullet did what. Some of those men carried that uncertainty for the rest of their lives, haunted by the thought that they might have fired the shot that killed Stonewall Jackson. And historians still debate the larger question: how much did his death actually change the war? Some argue that his loss doomed the Confederacy, that had Jackson lived, the campaign that ended at Gettysburg 2 months later might have unfolded very differently. Others caution that no single general wins or loses a war, and that the South's defeat was already written in numbers and industry and resolve. What is not in dispute is the shape of the story. A brilliant, ruthless commander at the summit of his greatest victory, brought down not by his enemy, but by the fear of his own men, in the confusion of a bright and terrible night. He won the battle, and it cost him everything. So here is the question worth sitting with. If the finest soldier a cause could ask for could be undone by a single, misread shape in the moonlight, how much of history really turns on skill and how much on the accidents no one can control? Thank you for spending this time with us here at Zephyr Creek Studios. If this story moved you, stay a while and let us cross over the river together into the next one.